Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger produced in several areas of the brain, including the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. Its primary role is in signaling reward, motivation, and reinforcement. When something desirable is anticipated or achieved, dopamine levels increase in key regions of the brain, particularly the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. This release reinforces the behavior that led to the reward, increasing the likelihood that it will be repeated. Dopamine is often associated with pleasure, but that's not entirely accurate. It's not responsible for the feeling of pleasure itself. Instead, it governs the drive to seek that pleasure. In other words, dopamine doesn't make you feel good. It makes you want to feel good. This distinction is crucial. The human brain has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to prioritize survival. In ancient environments, food was scarce, danger was constant, and reproduction was essential. Dopamine served as an internal guide, subtly nudging early humans toward behaviors that enhanced survival and reproduction. Finding food, shelter, warmth, and social cooperation. All these actions were reinforced by dopamine spikes. Modern humans still carry this biological system, but we live in an environment that's drastically different. Instead of rare, high-stakes rewards, we now encounter a constant stream of low-effort, high-reward stimuli. Processed food, endless entertainment, social validation through digital platforms, and instant access to virtually anything we desire. The dopamine system, finely tuned for scarcity, is now exposed to abundance. When you scroll through your phone and see a notification, dopamine is released. When you receive a compliment, complete a task, or win a game, dopamine is released. Even anticipating these rewards, not just experiencing them, triggers dopamine activity. In fact, dopamine levels often spike before a reward is received. This predictive mechanism is why anticipation can sometimes feel more powerful than the reward itself. It's also why behaviors that reliably produce rewards, like social media engagement, junk food consumption, or gambling, are especially addictive. The brain learns patterns. When a stimulus consistently precedes a reward, the brain begins to associate the two. This is known as incentive salience, the process by which a neutral cue becomes wanted because it predicts a reward. Over time, the cue itself becomes desirable, even if the reward diminishes. Consider a simple example: slot machines in a casino. Each spin is random, but the brain learns to expect the possibility of a win. The flashing lights, sounds, and animations become associated with the anticipation of reward. These cues trigger dopamine surges, encouraging repeated engagement even when actual rewards are rare. This is called intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the most powerful forms of behavioral conditioning. It's the same principle that keeps people checking their phones hundreds of times a day. Most notifications are meaningless, but occasionally one brings positive reinforcement. A like, a message, a validation. Dopamine teaches us that maybe the next one will be good, and so we keep checking. Dopamine also plays a role in habit formation. The brain has a structure called the basal ganglia, responsible for forming habits through repeated behavior. When an action is followed by a dopamine spike, it reinforces the neural pathway associated with that behavior. Over time, the behavior becomes automatic. This is why habits, both beneficial and destructive, can form without conscious intent. For instance, reaching for a phone first thing in the morning may begin as a conscious decision. But with enough repetition and dopamine reinforcement, it becomes a reflexive habit. The cue is waking up. The reward is novelty or social engagement. Dopamine links the two. In clinical neuroscience, Dopamine's role is most evident in two extreme conditions: Parkinson's disease and addiction. Parkinson's is caused by the death of dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra. As dopamine levels decline, patients lose motor control, experience tremors, and suffer from cognitive and emotional blunting. On the opposite end, addiction involves excessive stimulation of dopamine systems, often via drugs like cocaine, amphetamines, or opioids. These substances cause massive, unnatural dopamine spikes, far beyond what natural rewards can produce. The brain, in response, reduces its own dopamine sensitivity. This leads to a cycle of dependence. The baseline level of dopamine drops, and more of the substance is needed just to feel normal. This phenomenon isn't limited to drugs. Behavioral addictions, such as gambling, pornography, or compulsive internet use, follow similar neurochemical patterns. Dopamine is not inherently good or bad. It is a fundamental part of human neurobiology. However, when the system is overexposed to artificial stimulation, it adapts by becoming less sensitive. This is known as dopamine desensitization. Over time, the same behavior or stimulus produces a weaker effect. The result is a constant drive to seek more stimulation to achieve the same feeling. This leads to restlessness, lack of satisfaction, and reduced motivation, even when engaging in activities that once felt rewarding. This process is especially pronounced in environments with high stimulus frequency. Smartphones, social media, video platforms, processed food, and other modern conveniences deliver repeated, fast-acting rewards that can gradually lower dopamine baseline levels. To maintain healthy dopamine regulation, some researchers recommend implementing behavioral interventions that allow the brain's reward system to reset. These include reducing exposure to overstimulating content, such as limiting screen time or taking digital breaks, delaying gratification by practicing patience and resisting impulsive rewards, engaging in deep, focused work, which activates the dopamine system more sustainably than multitasking, spending time in nature, exercising, or meditating, all of which provide moderate, steady dopamine release, setting goals and achieving them through effort rather than shortcuts. The goal is not to eliminate dopamine spikes, but to space them out, make them meaningful, and allow time for recovery. In doing so, the brain becomes more sensitive to smaller rewards. Simple pleasures regain their appeal, focus improves, motivation returns. The mesolimbic pathway is commonly known as the reward pathway. It begins in the ventral tegmental area, located deep in the midbrain. From there, dopamine is released and travels to the nucleus accumbens, a core component of the brain's limbic system. This circuit plays a central role in processing reward, reinforcement, and motivation. When a person experiences something pleasurable, such as eating, listening to music, or engaging in social interaction, dopamine is released into this pathway. But it's not just about pleasure. This release also triggers the drive to repeat the behavior that caused the reward. That drive, called incentive salience, makes certain actions feel more urgent or desirable. Over time, repeated activation of this circuit can lead to behavioral conditioning, where cues or contexts associated with rewards become powerful motivators on their own. In addiction, this process becomes dysregulated. The brain is flooded with dopamine through repeated stimulation from drugs, gambling, or compulsive behaviors. The reward system adapts by reducing sensitivity, which leads to a diminished response. More stimulation is needed to achieve the same effect, creating a cycle of dependence. Another essential dopamine pathway starts in the same ventral tegmental area, but it projects to the prefrontal cortex. This region is responsible for executive functions: attention, decision-making, emotional regulation, and goal management. Dopamine in this circuit contributes to sustained focus and long-term planning. When functioning well, it allows an individual to prioritize tasks, resist distractions, and delay gratification in pursuit of future rewards. This balance is delicate. Disruption in this system can result in symptoms such as reduced motivation, poor concentration, and mood instability. In some mental health conditions, this circuit shows significant alteration. In depression, there is often reduced dopaminergic activity, contributing to a loss of interest and energy. In contrast, dysregulation in this pathway is also associated with disorders like schizophrenia, where dopamine imbalance can lead to impaired reasoning, emotional blunting, or cognitive fragmentation. Dopamine also plays a major role in movement. Another critical circuit begins in the substantia nigra, another area of the midbrain. Dopamine neurons here project to the dorsal striatum, which is essential for motor control. This connection helps the brain initiate and regulate voluntary movement, fine-tune coordination, and suppress unintended motion. When this circuit is impaired, movement becomes difficult. This is precisely what happens in Parkinson's disease, where dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra gradually die off. As dopamine levels drop, motor symptoms emerge: tremors, stiffness, bradykinesia, and postural instability. The impact of dopamine in this context is not about pleasure or reward, but about fluid physical function. That distinction reveals the versatility of this neurotransmitter. It adapts to the system it's part of. There's also a lesser-known dopamine circuit involved in hormonal regulation. It connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and it plays a subtle but important role in maintaining hormonal balance. In this circuit, dopamine acts as a suppressor of prolactin, a hormone involved in lactation and other metabolic functions. When dopamine levels fall in this system, due to medication or disease, prolactin can rise, leading to symptoms like menstrual disruption, decreased libido, or infertility. This kind of indirect effect shows how dopamine can influence systems beyond motivation or movement. It also explains why medications that block dopamine, such as antipsychotics, can cause hormonal side effects, even when they're targeting symptoms like delusions or hallucinations. Across all these systems, reward, cognition, movement, and hormonal regulation, dopamine operates as a modulator. It amplifies some signals and suppresses others. It does not act alone, but it has a disproportionately large influence on the systems it connects. When dopamine is balanced, behavior tends to be focused, motivated, and stable. When dopamine is disrupted through overstimulation, disease, or chemical interference, the consequences ripple across mood, behavior, and health. In this way, dopamine is less like a reward chemical and more like an internal compass. It points toward what the brain has learned to value, and that compass, once calibrated by experience, guides everything from curiosity and ambition to habit and obsession. One of the most fascinating aspects of dopamine is its role in anticipation. It doesn't just react to rewards. It often responds before the reward is even experienced. This is a feature, not a flaw. It allows organisms to prepare for action, to become alert and motivated when a potential benefit is predicted. From an evolutionary perspective, this pre-reward activity is a survival tool. The organism that moves toward food, shelter, or safety faster has a better chance of survival. Dopamine facilitates that movement, not just physically, but behaviorally and cognitively. When a cue is reliably followed by a reward, such as the sound of a bell before food or the opening screen of a favorite app, the brain begins to release dopamine in response to the cue itself. This phenomenon is well documented in both animal and human studies. Over time, the actual reward becomes less stimulating than the signal that precedes it. This is why anticipation often feels more exciting than the event itself. It's not about the thing, it's about the build-up to the thing. This pattern of cue, anticipation, and response is central to how habits form and how they are sustained. In controlled experiments, researchers have shown that dopamine levels rise most sharply just before a reward is expected, not during or after the reward is received. If the reward is unexpectedly withheld, dopamine levels drop sharply. This creates a kind of prediction error, which the brain uses to update future expectations. This feedback mechanism helps refine behavior over time. When an action no longer produces a reward, dopamine stops reinforcing it. When a new pattern emerges, dopamine adjusts to encourage that behavior instead. This is how organisms adapt to changing environments. The dopamine system is flexible, responsive, and highly sensitive to patterns, but it can also be misled. In artificial environments, where rewards are easy, frequent, and exaggerated, like on digital platforms, the anticipation loop becomes overactive. The brain begins to chase cues that no longer lead to meaningful outcomes, creating cycles of compulsive checking, scrolling, or engagement. This is particularly evident in slot machine behavior. Each spin of the wheel creates a new anticipation spike, even if the actual reward is rare. The unpredictability of the outcome actually strengthens the cycle. Dopamine doesn't require certainty, only possibility. This is called variable reinforcement, and it is among the most powerful forms of behavioral conditioning known. It's also used in many digital products. Notifications, likes, messages, recommendations, all are delivered on variable schedules, creating a constant sense of maybe this one will be good, and that maybe is often more motivating than a guaranteed result. As the brain becomes accustomed to frequent anticipation spikes, its baseline level of dopamine begins to adjust downward. In other words, the brain becomes less sensitive to ordinary stimulation. A walk, a book, a conversation, these begin to feel flat, uninteresting. This is not because life has become boring. It's because the reward system has been recalibrated. What used to feel engaging now competes with artificially potent stimuli. And the more the brain relies on those stimuli, the more difficult it becomes to sustain attention or motivation in low stimulation environments. This is why long-form tasks like reading, writing, or deep work often feel harder after prolonged exposure to fast, dopamine-rich inputs. The brain's capacity for sustained focus declines, not due to laziness, but due to neurochemical adaptation. It's also why moments of silence or boredom can feel uncomfortable. The brain interprets the absence of stimulation as a kind of deprivation, even though nothing is wrong. This is a withdrawal effect, not from a substance, but from a pattern of frequent dopamine spikes. But this is not permanent. The brain is capable of recovering. Dopamine sensitivity can return. The first step is to recognize the cycle. The second is to interrupt it, not by force, but by design. Reducing the frequency of artificial dopamine triggers allows the baseline to gradually rise again. This process is known as resensitization. When the dopamine system becomes less reactive, even small rewards begin to feel more meaningful again. Enjoyment returns to everyday activities. Anticipation becomes more measured and less frantic. Over time, the brain becomes better at distinguishing between signals worth pursuing and distractions to ignore. The power of dopamine is not just in what it makes us do, but in what it teaches us to want. By understanding how it responds to anticipation, we can learn to build healthier systems of motivation. ones that are based not on compulsive novelty, but on meaningful progress. Habits are not simply repeated behaviors, they are encoded patterns of action, triggered by cues and reinforced by outcomes. At the center of this system is dopamine. When an action leads to a positive outcome, even a small one, dopamine is released. That release doesn't just feel rewarding. It strengthens the neural pathways that produce the behavior, making it more likely to occur again in the future. This is called synaptic reinforcement. The brain literally becomes more efficient at repeating the behavior, and over time, the action becomes automatic. This is how habits are built, not through willpower alone, but through neurochemical repetition. Dopamine acts as the glue that binds behavior to outcome. Most habits follow a predictable pattern: cue, action, reward. The cue is something in the environment, a time of day, a location, a feeling. The action is the behavior: checking a phone, opening a snack, going for a run. The reward is the outcome that the brain evaluates, often unconsciously, to determine if the action should be repeated. If dopamine is released during or after the behavior, the loop is reinforced. The stronger the dopamine response, the stronger the habit becomes. This applies to positive and negative habits alike. The brain does not assign moral value. It simply tracks patterns that lead to rewarding outcomes, regardless of their long-term consequences. This is why some habits feel effortless, while others require active resistance. It's also why simply deciding to break a habit is rarely effective. Unless the cue is removed or the reward is altered, the pattern remains intact. In some cases, even the anticipation of the reward is enough to trigger the habit. The smell of food can initiate a craving. The buzz of a phone can create tension. The thought of checking an app can trigger a subtle, almost unconscious motor sequence. This automaticity is not weakness, it's efficiency. The brain offloads repeated tasks to conserve energy, relying on past reinforcement to guide present behavior. But this system can be hijacked. Modern environments are filled with artificial cues and engineered rewards. From personalized recommendations to gamified interfaces, many products are designed to create fast, reliable dopamine responses. These responses bypass the brain's natural pacing. They don't require effort, time, or patience. They shortcut the process, and in doing so, they strengthen habits that may not align with long-term goals. To change a habit, the loop must be disrupted. One way is by modifying the cue. Changing the environment can reduce exposure to triggers. For example, turning off notifications, changing routines, or removing visual stimuli can weaken the automatic link between cue and behavior. Another approach is to change the action, replacing an unhelpful behavior with a more beneficial one that still satisfies the underlying craving. For example, someone who reaches for a phone out of boredom might instead pick up a book. Over time, the new behavior can become the default response. But perhaps the most powerful intervention is adjusting the reward. When the reward becomes less immediate or less satisfying, dopamine release diminishes. This weakens the reinforcement. On the other hand, increasing the reward for a more constructive behavior can accelerate habit formation. This is the basis of intentional habit design. It recognizes the role of dopamine not as a force to resist, but as a mechanism to understand and redirect. By aligning cues, actions, and rewards with long-term values, habits can be shaped in ways that support well-being rather than undermine it. The process is gradual. It requires awareness, consistency, and sometimes discomfort. But the brain is not static. Its pathways are adaptable. What is automatic today can be reshaped tomorrow. And dopamine is the key to that change. Dopamine doesn't just influence how we feel, it shapes how we focus. In the brain, focus is not simply about attention, it's about priority. Out of the thousands of sensory inputs and internal thoughts we encounter at any given moment, dopamine helps select which ones deserve our mental resources. This is particularly true in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with planning, working memory, and cognitive control. When dopamine levels in this region are optimal, the brain can filter distractions, maintain concentration, and sustain effort toward a goal. However, this balance is fragile. Too little dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, and the brain becomes sluggish. It struggles to hold information in working memory. Attention drifts. Tasks feel effortful. This pattern is common in conditions like attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, where dopamine signaling is often impaired. Too much dopamine, on the other hand, can lead to hyperfocus, a state where attention is so tightly locked onto a single stimulus that broader context is lost. This is seen in certain states of stress, mania, or stimulant use. Both extremes, underfocus and overfocus, highlight dopamine's role as a regulator of cognitive engagement. In everyday life, dopamine helps bridge the gap between intention and action. It's what makes goals feel urgent, what gives momentum to tasks that might otherwise feel tedious or overwhelming. But this system is sensitive to context. If rewards are too distant, abstract, or inconsistent, dopamine may not rise enough to initiate action. The brain, especially under conditions of fatigue or stress, may default to lower effort behaviors, ones with faster or more predictable dopamine returns. This is why procrastination isn't always about laziness. Often, it's about a mismatch between task demands and available motivation. When dopamine does not sufficiently activate the prefrontal cortex, even simple actions can feel insurmountable. Understanding this has important implications for productivity and behavior. One strategy to improve focus is to break large abstract goals into smaller concrete steps. Each step completed becomes a mini reward, producing a manageable dopamine increase that reinforces progress. Another strategy is to reduce competing stimuli. When the brain is flooded with novelty, such as background notifications, social media tabs, or multitasking, dopamine is dispersed across multiple targets. Focus fragments. The brain becomes reactive instead of directed, creating an environment that supports sustained attention through minimal distractions, clear goals, and structured breaks, helps dopamine support deeper engagement. Physical factors also matter. Sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, chronic stress, and lack of physical activity can all disrupt dopamine function, making it harder to focus and stay motivated. This is because dopamine is synthesized from basic nutrients, including amino acids like tyrosine, and its release is modulated by neural energy levels, circadian rhythms, and hormonal balance. Motivation, then, is not a static trait. It is a dynamic state, influenced by biological, psychological, and environmental factors. And at the heart of this state is dopamine. When functioning well, dopamine allows for what psychologists call task salience. It helps the brain recognize what matters, why it matters, and what needs to be done next. This sense of directed energy, of knowing what to do and wanting to do it, is not a mystery. It is a reflection of an optimally engaged dopamine system. And like any system, it can be strengthened, supported, and recalibrated with awareness and care. While dopamine is commonly associated with motivation and drive, its disruption plays a central role in some of the most challenging mental health conditions, particularly depression. In clinical depression, symptoms often go beyond sadness. Many individuals report a deep loss of energy, an inability to initiate tasks, and a disconnection from joy or purpose. This isn't simply emotional, it is neurological. Studies using brain imaging have consistently shown reduced activity in dopamine-rich areas of the brain, especially the ventral striatum and prefrontal cortex among people with depression. These areas are involved in reward processing, anticipation, and goal-directed behavior. When dopamine signaling is reduced, it becomes more difficult to generate motivation, even for activities that were once enjoyable. This symptom is called anhedonia, the diminished ability to experience pleasure. But more than that, it's the inability to want pleasure that characterizes dopamine-related depression. It's not that enjoyable experiences don't exist, it's that the drive to pursue them has faded. This type of depression isn't simply sadness, it's a flattening of desire, a loss of orientation toward the future. In some cases, this can manifest as physical symptoms too. Individuals may move more slowly, speak less, or feel mentally foggy. These are signs of a broader decline in dopaminergic activity. Antidepressants commonly target serotonin, another neurotransmitter involved in mood regulation. But a subset of antidepressants, particularly those classified as dopamine norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors such as bupropion, aim to increase dopamine levels more directly. These medications can help restore motivation and energy in patients where apathy and fatigue are dominant symptoms. However, they are not universally effective, and dopamine is only one part of a much more complex network involving multiple neurotransmitters and brain systems. Chronic stress is another major factor that depletes dopamine. Under conditions of sustained psychological stress, the body produces elevated levels of cortisol, a stress hormone that affects nearly every system in the brain. Over time, high cortisol can reduce dopamine synthesis, impair dopamine receptor sensitivity, and disrupt the circuits that regulate emotional and cognitive balance. This stress-induced depletion creates a feedback loop. Low dopamine makes it harder to take productive action, which can lead to more stress, which in turn further depletes dopamine. Sleep disturbances, common in depression, also worsen this process. Dopamine plays a role in regulating circadian rhythms. When sleep is poor or irregular, dopamine signaling becomes less efficient, impairing both mood and cognitive function. These connections suggest that restoring dopamine balance may require more than medication alone. Lifestyle interventions can play a powerful role. Regular physical activity, especially aerobic exercise, has been shown to increase dopamine release and receptor density. Exercise doesn't just improve mood temporarily, it promotes long-term structural changes in the brain that support resilience and motivation. Adequate sleep, especially deep sleep stages, helps the brain clear neurochemical waste and rebalance dopamine levels for the next day. Nutrition also plays a role. Dopamine is synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine, which is found in protein-rich foods. Diets lacking in key nutrients like iron, magnesium, vitamin B6, and omega-3 fatty acids can impair dopamine production. Even sunlight matters. Exposure to natural light increases dopamine levels in the retina, which not only affects visual processing, but helps synchronize circadian rhythms and regulate energy levels. This illustrates a key idea in mental health. The brain is not isolated from the body or the environment. Dopamine exists within a dynamic system, and small adjustments in sleep, diet, activity, and stress can have measurable effects on its function. While depression is complex and multifactorial, a better understanding of dopamine can reveal why certain symptoms emerge and what can be done gradually and patiently to support recovery. Addiction is one of the most well-studied consequences of dopamine system dysfunction. At its core, addiction involves the repeated use of a substance or behavior despite negative consequences. What makes addiction so persistent is that it fundamentally alters the brain's reward system, and dopamine plays a central role in that alteration. When a person uses a highly stimulating drug, such as cocaine, methamphetamine, or nicotine, dopamine is released in large quantities, far exceeding what natural rewards like food or social contact would produce. This creates an intense surge of pleasure or euphoria, but the brain is adaptive. When dopamine is consistently overstimulated, the brain reduces its sensitivity to it. Dopamine receptors become less responsive. The number of available receptors may also decrease. Over time, the same dose of the substance produces a weaker effect. This process is called downregulation. As a result, the individual begins to seek more of the substance, or more frequent use, to achieve the same initial effect. This is known as tolerance. Eventually, the brain's baseline dopamine level begins to drop. Not only does the person stop feeling pleasure from the substance, they may stop feeling pleasure at all, every day. Experiences no longer stimulate the reward system in the same way. Joy, interest, and motivation fade. This is a hallmark of addiction, the narrowing of pleasure sources. The individual becomes less responsive to anything that isn't the addictive substance or behavior. In this state, using the substance is no longer about getting high. It becomes about avoiding discomfort. The absence of the drug produces withdrawal, both physical and psychological, and dopamine plays a role in that pain. But substances aren't the only triggers. Behavioral addictions, such as gambling, gaming, pornography, and even compulsive shopping or eating, can follow similar neurological pathways. These behaviors may not involve external chemicals, but they still lead to spikes in dopamine. When repeated frequently, they can cause the same downregulation, tolerance, and withdrawal symptoms. This is why the brain treats some behaviors like substances, because the reward system doesn't distinguish between a chemical high and a digital one. It only tracks the pattern of stimulation and reinforcement. Recovery from addiction, whether substance-related or behavioral, involves restoring balance to the dopamine system. This is not a quick process. In the early stages of withdrawal, dopamine levels may remain low. The individual may feel unmotivated, joyless, and unable to engage with ordinary life. This phase, sometimes called anhedonic withdrawal, is one of the main reasons people relapse. The absence of dopamine makes everything feel flat, but the brain is plastic. Over time, with abstinence and support, receptor sensitivity can return. Baseline levels can normalize. The capacity to feel pleasure from natural rewards can slowly come back. Many recovery programs encourage activities that naturally support dopamine balance, like regular exercise, stable routines, meaningful social contact, and mindfulness practices. These provide moderate, sustainable dopamine stimulation without the extremes of addiction. Some individuals benefit from medication, particularly when withdrawal symptoms are severe or when underlying conditions like depression or anxiety are present. But even then, the goal is to stabilize the dopamine system, not overstimulate it again. One of the most powerful tools in recovery is time. The longer the brain goes without extreme spikes, the more it can recalibrate. This doesn't mean a person returns to who they were before addiction, but it does mean they can build a new, more stable baseline, one that responds to real rewards, not artificial highs. Understanding dopamine helps explain both the pull of addiction and the possibility of recovery. It's not just about willpower, it's about chemistry, habit, and healing. Modern technology has changed how dopamine functions in daily life, not because the brain has changed, but because the environment around it has become more optimized for instant reward. Every ping, scroll, swipe, and notification is a potential dopamine trigger. Unlike natural rewards that come after effort, digital rewards are often immediate, frequent, and designed to hold attention. Social media, for example, is engineered to provide unpredictable reinforcement. Each refresh of the feed may bring something interesting, funny, validating, or it may not. That unpredictability mimics the reward schedule used in slot machines, which is known to produce the highest rates of repeat engagement. This kind of stimulation taps directly into the brain's dopamine circuits. The novelty, the anticipation, the possibility of reward all cause dopamine to rise, even if the actual content is unremarkable. Over time, the brain adapts. Baseline dopamine levels may drop, and attention becomes harder to sustain without frequent stimulation. This doesn't just make it harder to concentrate, it makes slower, deeper forms of engagement feel less satisfying. Reading a book, having a conversation, or completing a long project might feel more difficult. Not because they are objectively harder, but because they don't offer the same rapid-fire dopamine feedback that digital platforms provide. This is especially pronounced in younger brains. In adolescents and young adults, dopamine systems are more active and more sensitive. This increases the appeal of high-stimulation environments and makes the effects of digital overuse more pronounced. But the impact is not limited to youth. Adults, too, are susceptible to the dopamine feedback loop created by technology. The average person checks their phone dozens, sometimes hundreds, of times per day. Much of this behavior is not intentional. It's automatic, driven by subtle cues and reinforced by variable rewards. Notifications, badges, sounds, and even the layout of apps are designed to maintain engagement. In a way, the phone becomes a pocket-sized dopamine dispenser, always within reach. This constant stimulation can reduce tolerance for boredom. Moments of stillness, waiting in line, sitting in silence, walking without headphones, begin to feel uncomfortable. The brain, used to rapid input, interprets the absence of stimulation as something to fix. But boredom is not a problem. It is a signal, an opportunity for creativity, rest, or reflection. When constantly interrupted by dopamine-driven impulses, those moments are lost. Multitasking, too, affects dopamine function. Switching between tasks quickly, checking messages during work, flipping between tabs, pausing a video to reply to a text, splits attention and fragments focus. Each switch may provide a small burst of novelty, but it comes at a cost. The brain becomes less efficient at deep work. It spends more time reorienting and less time progressing. Over time, this lowers productivity and increases cognitive fatigue. The solution is not to eliminate technology, but to become more intentional with its use. Simple changes can reduce excessive dopamine stimulation, turning off non-essential notifications, using grayscale mode to reduce visual salience, scheduling specific times for checking messages or social media, practicing daily periods of tech-free time, replacing reactive use with intentional goal-driven interaction. These changes help recalibrate the brain's reward system. When digital stimulation is moderated, the brain becomes more responsive to other, slower forms of reward, such as focus, learning, conversation, or creation. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It requires discomfort, patience, and consistency. But the benefits are long-lasting. With time, attention improves, patience grows, joy returns to simple activities, and dopamine, once scattered and overstimulated, begins to function as it was meant to, as a guide toward meaningful, sustainable rewards. When the dopamine system is overwhelmed by excessive stimulation, chronic stress, or compulsive habits, it gradually loses its sensitivity. Things that once brought pleasure may feel dull. Tasks that once sparked motivation may now seem pointless. This state is sometimes referred to as dopamine burnout. It's not an official medical diagnosis, but it describes a familiar feeling. Low energy, low motivation, and a constant pull toward high-stimulation distractions, even when they no longer satisfy. To recover from this state, many people experiment with what's known as a dopamine reset, a period of reduced stimulation designed to help the brain recalibrate. The term itself can be misleading. Dopamine doesn't need to be reset like a machine. It's not about eliminating dopamine, which is essential for healthy function. Rather, it's about creating space for the brain to resensitize to normal levels of stimulation. One approach is the dopamine detox, which involves abstaining from all high dopamine triggers for a short period, usually a day or two. This might include avoiding screens, processed food, caffeine, music, social media, or even talking, depending on how far one wants to go. The idea isn't to punish the brain, but to give it a break, to remove constant spikes so the baseline can begin to rise again. Even short breaks can have measurable effects. After a period of reduced input, simple experiences, walking outside, reading, listening to music, often feel richer, more engaging. The absence of noise allows quieter signals to be noticed. But the most sustainable approach to dopamine recovery is not a one-time detox. It's a gradual shift in lifestyle, a recalibration of how rewards are pursued and how often they are consumed. This means spacing out rewards, giving the brain time to return to baseline before the next stimulation. It means reducing multitasking, slowing down consumption, and reintroducing more effortful forms of pleasure. Delayed gratification plays a key role here. When rewards come after effort, the dopamine system responds differently. It produces a longer-lasting sense of satisfaction rather than a quick spike followed by a crash. For example, preparing a meal from scratch tends to feel more rewarding than ordering fast food. Writing something by hand feels different than scrolling through short clips. These aren't just psychological preferences, they are neurochemical differences. Physical activity is another powerful regulator. Exercise increases dopamine production, receptor sensitivity, and the release of other chemicals that support mood and focus. It's one of the most reliable ways to support long-term dopamine health. Sleep is equally important. During deep sleep, the brain performs maintenance tasks, including the regulation of neurotransmitter levels. Chronic sleep deprivation reduces dopamine receptor density, making the brain less responsive to rewards and more prone to cravings. Meaningful goals also help. The dopamine system responds not just to pleasure, but to purpose. When actions are connected to personal values, learning, helping, building, creating, dopamine rises in a more sustainable, reinforcing way. Even setting small goals and completing them can produce this effect. A to-do list, broken into simple steps, allows for frequent micro-rewards. Each checkmark becomes a signal. Progress is being made. Social connection supports dopamine regulation too. Shared laughter, eye contact, physical touch, and mutual support all stimulate dopamine in ways that digital likes or messages cannot replicate. These are ancient, deeply wired sources of reward. There's no single protocol for a dopamine reset. It's less about following strict rules and more about creating an environment where the brain can heal from overstimulation and rediscover the richness of ordinary experience. The result is not a life without pleasure, but a life where pleasure is real again, earned, noticed, and savored. Dopamine is not an enemy to be defeated or a force to be mastered. It's a fundamental part of being human, a tool the brain uses to guide attention, reinforce behavior, and pursue goals. But like any tool, it can be used skillfully or carelessly. When misunderstood, dopamine can lead to cycles of overstimulation, distraction, and dissatisfaction. It can pull attention towards shallow rewards and away from deeper fulfillment. It can turn restlessness into addiction, curiosity into compulsion. Yet when understood, When aligned with values, structured with intention, and supported by healthy rhythms, dopamine becomes a source of energy and focus. It helps turn effort into growth, repetition into mastery, and desire into discipline. This begins with awareness. Recognizing how environments, habits, and tools affect the dopamine system allows for more informed choices. It means noticing when stimulation becomes excessive, when attention feels fragmented, or when motivation has been hijacked. It also means becoming more deliberate about the kinds of rewards that are pursued. Natural rewards, like progress, learning, contribution, and connection, take longer to develop but offer longer-lasting satisfaction. They don't exhaust the dopamine system, they strengthen it. This is the difference between chasing a feeling and building a life. It helps to return to simplicity, to moments without constant input, to activities that unfold slowly, reading, walking, cooking, reflecting. These are not escapes from stimulation. They are antidotes to overstimulation. They give the brain a chance to breathe and dopamine a chance to recalibrate. Living in harmony with dopamine also involves rhythm, alternating effort with rest, stimulation with stillness. The brain thrives on cycles. When work is followed by genuine downtime, when goals are punctuated by recovery, motivation becomes more sustainable. Dopamine doesn't need to be suppressed. It needs to be paced. Technology can still be used. Rewards can still be enjoyed. But the key is spacing, intention, and clarity. Not every urge needs to be answered. Not every moment needs to be filled. By stepping out of the loop of constant seeking, the brain becomes more responsive. Pleasure returns. Curiosity deepens. Focus sharpens. In this space, discipline doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like freedom. The freedom to choose where attention goes, how time is spent, and what kind of life is being built. Understanding dopamine reveals more than just a chemical process. It reveals a mirror of modern life, our habits, distractions, cravings, and hopes. It also offers a map, one that can guide us back to presence, purpose, and peace.